Welcome, everybody, for participating in this special event today. My name is José Batista. I am Community and Events Manager at Cogitatio Press, and I am delighted to have everyone here for this special webinar celebrating the International Day for Women and Girls in Science. The purpose of this event is to address the ongoing challenges that women face in research and academia. And to do so, we've brought this remarkable panel of speakers through which we aim to highlight women-led research and initiatives that advance gender equality in academic spaces. To achieve that, our discussion will cover the following topics. So firstly, we'll have Beatriz Ribeiro talking about the gender gap in academic publishing. We'll then move on to Bridget Keown, talking about some myths and stereotypes on gender roles in science. Onwards, we'll move on to Brigitte, who will speak to us about how women scientists become visible on social media. And last but not least, Lena Weber will be speaking to us about the work being developed at the Center of Excellence for Women in Science, the CEWS. Before we kick things off, I would just like to tell you a little bit how this works. So after these presentations, we have a space for questions and answers by our audience, and we expect you to come forward with your questions and your comments on this webinar. How it works is there is a dedicated Q&A box, I believe, right below my face right now. Do not confuse it for the general chat. And as your questions come up during the presentations, feel free to leave them in the Q&A box. We will be collecting them throughout the webinar, and then I'll be addressing each of them to the respective speaker. Or if your question has no direct recipient, I'll leave it out there and see which one of our speakers wants to tackle that specific question. Another thing before we start, this webinar is being recorded. So if you want to revisit this conversation after this live event, you can do so through our YouTube channel at Cogitatio Press. Or if you have an acquaintance or a colleague who couldn't come, this recording will be available in full and for free on our YouTube channel shortly after this session. So without further ado, I will welcome Beatriz Ribeiro to the virtual stage. To our audience, Beatriz Ribeiro is a fourth-year PhD candidate in political science at the School of Social Sciences and Humanities at Nova University of Lisbon. She's also an associate researcher at the Português Institute of International Relations, and her research focuses on the intersection of public policy implementation and feminist theory. She has published in journals such as Violence Against Women and European Political Science Review, and has presented at major international conferences. Today, she's teaching Introduction to Political Science to first-year students in the Politics, Economy and Society program at IPRI in Lisbon. She's also co-author of the paper Mind the Submission Gap, EPSR Gender Data and Female Authors Publishing Perceptions, which I will link in the chat box in case any of you want to have a read, because it relates a lot to the presentation that we're about to hear. So Beatriz, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for this lovely introduction, and hello to everyone wherever you are in the world. As I see here on the chat, it's very around the world. I'll just share my screen real quick. You should be able to see it now. Okay, perfect. Then I'll start by wishing everyone a happy International Day of Women and Girls in Science, as José just did as well. And as he also very kindly introduced me, I will be talking to you a little bit today about the gender gap in academic publishing. We'll firstly start with discussing a little bit about gender equality in academia, and then go further into the gender equality in academic publishing, trying to answer the question of, is there a gender gap in publishing or isn't there one? Spoiler alert, there is a gender gap in academic publishing. And I'll briefly try to conclude by trying to explain what causes this gender gap in academic publishing. So just a brief introduction, some shocker opening remarks. There is no gender equality in academia or in science. Women have faced gender discrimination in science and in academia, and this is an historical phenomenon. It has cultural and social roots. Women face discrimination due to social stigma, sexism, biased judgments about women's work and capabilities. And women have been historically discriminated in science, both hard and social sciences. Although today I'll focus a little bit more about social sciences, which is the area that I'm from. Just a brief introduction as well before I go into the gender inequality / equality in academic publishing. Women face a lot of discrimination, and there is gender inequality in academia in multiple forms, not just in publishing. There's a lack of recognition of women's works, and this is an historical phenomenon. We know of famous names like Marie Curie. Especially this was very prominent in women scientists in the hard sciences, but this obviously still lasts until today in all areas of science. There's also some very interesting literature that I've cited here that shows that women are also discriminated in teaching evaluations. So students from both genders tend to evaluate women with a lesser grade when women teach very similar courses to men and with very similar methods as men. There's also inequality / discrimination in the representation in publishing. There's way less women editors. Editors invite way less women to publish in their journals, etc. I'm sure we're also all familiar with glass ceiling processes at universities. There's way less women that reach positions of, for example, dean than men. And there's also some studies that show that there's a disparity in academic positions. So men tend to reach tenure more easily or have been reaching tenure more than women. And also women tend to, according to some studies, have more hours of teaching and also more hours of bureaucratic work in the universities. Obviously, there's sexual misconduct / sexual harassment in any workplace or in any place, if you ask me. So it's no surprise that we also find sexual misconduct and sexual harassment in academic places and in universities. There's also some studies who show that women face discrepancies in funding. So men tend to receive funding more than women. And then the topic of my talk today, women publish less than men. Okay, just a brief introduction. Why is this relevant? Why is it relevant that we talk about a gender gap in academic publishing? I'm sure everyone understands this, but I thought it would be interesting to bring it up to the discussion as well, that speaking about the gender gap in academic publishing is very relevant because publications are a big part of the scientific / academic profession, because publications are super important to reach tenure track or to go up in the ladder of the profession. Also associated with the number of citations to said publications. So this is a very important topic when we're discussing equality in academia. And there is a clear publishing gap in almost all disciplines, from hard sciences to social sciences. I just brought some numbers from some disciplines. Obviously, I couldn't bring them all. So, for example, in political science, less than 30% of the publications are of women. In economics as well, less than 30%. And then, obviously, this prominent in the hard sciences. So, for example, mathematics, less than 20% are of women, engineering 23%, chemistry is somewhat similar to political science and economics with 33%. So clearly less than half. This is just something I found that I thought that was very interesting to share. This is the 25 most cited books in the social sciences ever. And as you can see, only 2 authors here are women, and only 1 woman is the main author. So the other woman, Susan Falkman, is a second author. So just to show that this is historical, it's not just something that is happening right now. And then I think the next important parts for us to discuss is that, okay, we know that there exists a gender gap in academic publishing, but what causes it? And as I was doing research, and as José also said, I co-authored a paper on this topic. We thought that there are 3 important topics to go over and to try and answer this question. First of all, the first thing our mind goes to is that, okay, maybe there's less women publishing because there's less women in the profession. So there are less women academics, and therefore it would be normal that women publish less because it would be proportional. Then a second option would be, are women's manuscripts accepted less than men? So even if there's parity in the disciplines, could it be the case that women's manuscripts are being rejected at a higher rate than men? And we could have some sort of discrimination at the acceptance stage. And finally, the last one, is it the fact that women submit less? So we have, let's say, a scenario where we have the same number of men and women in the profession. Women and men submit the same number of academic papers, but then, women and men do not submit the same number of academic papers. That's what I meant. Even though they're in the acceptance rates, they would be accepted similarly. And I'll try to answer these three questions now. So trying to answer the first question, are there less women academics? This doesn't seem to be the case. And as we go, as years go by, this really doesn't seem to be the case, because as we know, women are starting to outnumber men, both in bachelor's and in master's, and even in doctorate holders are starting to become almost 50-50. So recent data from the OECD from 2022 said that 44% of doctorate holders worldwide are women. And the European Commission has this rate at 48, so it should be almost 50%, very similar. For example, in political science, my discipline, women have hold around 40% of all the PhDs in the discipline. And it's interesting to note that, for example, in sociology, women have more PhDs than men, so around 60% of doctorate women in sociology are obviously women. So it doesn't seem to be the case that this gender gap in publishing is deriving from the fact there are less women in the profession. So let's try and look at the second option. Could it be the case that women's manuscripts are accepted less than men's? Could it be the case that we're seeing a case of a gender gap in manuscript acceptance? This was, when I was starting to do this research, this is what I thought we would find. But actually, research has been pretty consistent in showing that this, in fact, is not the case. And a lot of studies show that there doesn't seem to be a significant discrepancy at the acceptance stage. For example, in the paper that I co-authored, we analyzed all the submitted manuscripts from 2010 and 2019 in the European Political Science Review, and we found that actually it was the other way around. The acceptance ratio for men was around 80%, and for women was 22%. So women's manuscripts were being accepted a little bit more than men's. So it also doesn't seem to be the case that there is a gender gap in manuscript acceptance. So this leads us to our third hypothesis, the fact that women submit less papers than men. And this seems to be the most consensual answer, at least in the social sciences, which is the literature that I know best. Again, in the paper that I co-authored about the European Political Science Review, we looked at all the submissions from 2010 to 2019, and we found that 75% of those were of men, and only 25% were of women. So men are submitting a lot more papers than women, but then at the acceptance stage, the acceptance rate is pretty similar, or women are accepted a tiny bit higher than men. So in conclusion, here the problem seems to be in the submission. And what we did in this paper that we analyzed, the journal that I was just talking about, as well as doing some literature review on the topic, we found more or less 4 factors that contribute to the fact that women submit less papers than men. So the first of all is the fact that in general, and all of this is in general, these are not like straight up rules, but in general, women can be more risk averse than men, / men can be more confident. And here we know this is due to like social and cultural norms. And this obviously has an impact in submission. And there are some studies who find that men are significantly more inclined than women to feel confident to submit their manuscripts, and also to submit them to really prestigious papers. So it's way more common for a man to feel confident in submitting their work to a top-tier journal than a woman. Then, second factor, women unfortunately still have less time for research. we do know that still around the world, it is still up to women to do most of the domestic work, care, children, cleaning, cooking, etc. And obviously, this takes up free time, and this is less time that women can dedicate to investigation and to produce papers to then submit. And at the same time, this goes back to what I was saying in the beginning. We also know from previous research that women have less time for research because when they're already in the universities, they have a higher share of teaching or of admin and bureaucratic work, which also takes time away from research. Then a third factor, which is really interesting, is the fact that women benefit less from co-authorship. So when you look at journals, you find a lot more men co-authoring with each other than women co-authoring with each other. Maybe this is due to networking or boys' clubs in universities, so men trying to or being able to bring other men in due to these informal networkings that usually tend to like leave women outside of these clubs, of these all boys clubs. And the last factor, the factor about methods. There's some correlation between women and the type of methods that women use in their research. So there's a lot more women using qualitative methodologies than men, and there's a lot more men doing quantitative methodologies than women. This, I'm not trying to establish any sort of causation and say women can only do this sort of work and men can only do that type of work. I'm just saying in terms of numbers, when you look at the number of papers that have been published, there are indeed more women doing qualitative and men doing quantitative. And we also know that qualitative methodologies can be more time consuming on one hand. And then on the other hand, very important as well, is that we also know that journals overall tend to publish more quantitative methodologies still, even though hopefully this is changing. There's some opening to qualitative, but still there's this factor of women using more qualitative. This is more time consuming, and this is published less by journals. So these are the 4 factors that we found and then literature overall finds. And just to very quickly finish my talk, some ways forward. For example, women that have published in the journal that we analyzed, we asked them, what do you think journals could do to try and improve the gender gap in academic publishing? And they said an important factor would be parity in the editorial teams and in pool of reviewers. Also actively encouraging women to submit, like, for example, targeting a woman and saying, I would really like you to publish in my journal, for example. Also ensuring that the submission process is perfectly blind, because we do know that peer review is blind, but women said that sometimes if you Google someone or you try to associate a research to a name, this can still be harmful for women. So reviewers should really try to ensure that the submission process is completely blind. Also, this is what some women also said in our study, that make sure the reviews you give to the papers that are being submitted are constructive and pragmatic and are not nitpicky, let's say. And also, this is like for journals and science overall, try and change the paradigm on methods and try to see equally qual and quantitative methodologies. Then I guess in universities, it would also be important to have a conversation about how to fairly distribute teaching loads, admin loads, how to fairly ensure that everyone's getting the same funding, or at least getting the same opportunities to apply to funding, and ensuring that there's no bias in those processes as well. And then obviously when we're talking about gender equality, it doesn't matter if it's in academia, where is it? We obviously need to talk about societal changes. And unfortunately, there's no like pragmatic steps I can give here, like, true, there's parity in this or that. But I guess we still need to work on the fact that women still do most of the domestic work, that there's a lot of boys' clubs in universities and elsewhere, and work on perception bias that women are less capable than men to do same jobs or different jobs and be perceived equally than everyone in society. But I'll never be able to resolve gender equality, so these are just some ideas. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Beatriz, for your presentation. Thank you as well to our attendees who've crossed the 200 mark, and it's so great to see so many people coming together for this important topic. I will call to the virtual stage Bridget Keown now. Um, Bridget is a teaching assistant professor in gender and science at the University of Pittsburgh. She holds a PhD in history from Northeastern University, where her research focused on the experience and treatment of war-related trauma among British and Irish women during the First World War and the Irish War of Independence, as well as how history is constructed through trauma. She has shared her work through publications with the American Historical Association, Lady Science, and Nursing Cleo. Her broad academic interests span the history of emotions, medicine, gender studies, the horror genre, and post-colonial queer theory and performance. She also serves as co-chair of the Gender and Memory Working Group of the Memory Studies Association and is on the Executive Council of the American Conference for Irish Studies. And we are very honored to have her insights today as we address some gendered myths and stereotypes that are pervasive in our scientific ethos. So, Bridget, whenever you want, the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the honor of being here and being able to speak to all of you today. This really means the world to me. So in thinking about myths and stereotypes of gender roles in science, usually in my class, I approach problems from a historic point of view. So specifically, I think as a historian when addressing these problems. And I'm often struck in, especially my intro classes, when I ask students what brings them to class, why they chose to take a gender and science course. And it's shocking to me how often individual students will tell me that they're not a science person or they've never liked science and that this seemed like the most doable class for them in order to succeed. And the more I heard that response, the more I really started thinking about what it meant to be a science person and the implications of that in the short term for my individual students, but how that idea could be inculcated. And in looking back in history, what we see is this idea repeated over and over again, explicitly and implicitly, that scientists are born, that there is an inherent brain structure, there is an inherent physicality, and there is an inherent set of behaviors that define one as a scientist, and that people who don't fit into those criteria either are the exception that prove the rule or are valued less as scientists overall. And the reasons behind this are social and cultural, but many of them are rooted in the history of science and the individual fields of science themselves. So that was kind of the way I have approached this presentation today, and also the way I approach my teaching. So when we talk about a lot of these issues, what we're talking about at the core is this idea of gender essentialism. So that's the belief that gender is a discrete binary, that one is born male or born female, and that there is no spectrum of difference, even though we understand that intersex people exist. There is also this idea that one has to completely change one's designation or gender in order to be considered valued as a human person. We also have this belief that gender itself is biologically determined, immutable, and responsible for all behaviors, skills, and or potential that a gendered body exhibits. So it's this idea that men are born inherently good at spatial relations and visual skills, whereas women are inherently born with emotional aptitude and the ability to network with individual people. It's essentially this idea that biology is destiny. And there is a historic precedent for this, even as we see it play out in our present. Because these assumptions, again, whether we state them or not, are representative of gender bias. So it's this belief in individuals based on their sex. So again, this idea that men and women think or behave differently, specifically because they are men or women, that your education and your experiences are secondary to this inherent truth that is born into you by your reproductive organs and your chromosomes. And the perpetuation of this difference, this assuming that gender difference is at the core of who we are, leads to results that are scientifically misleading, what are often often referred to as zombie facts, because they uphold these stereotypical assumptions even without justification. And in doing so, they continue to validate discriminatory or exclusionary policies based on this idea not only that people are different, but that there are hierarchies of difference, that people who have attained more status, more power, more money are evidence of being born better with that inherent truth in them, rather than the social or cultural implications that led them to their success. And we can see this reinforced in power structures today. We can also see it reinforced in pay gaps, research awards, the way that authors get cited on papers to our last presentation, and the way that people's performances are rated on the job. We can also see it in the way that patients are treated in medical scenarios, the way that textbooks are written, things like that. And each of these practices reinforces these ideas over and over again until they become something that feels inherent rather than something that is enforced. And we're going to briefly think about some of the roots of these and understand the way these gender biases form a through line in a historical setting up to the present. And I hopefully think that gives us some insight into ways of actually fixing these problems, debunking these myths. So one of the texts that I give to my students to read a lot is a text by Edward H. Clarke, which was published in 1873. It's an enormously popular work. It references Darwinian forms of thinking. Darwin himself is deeply invested in this idea of not only gender difference, but gender hierarchies as well, and explaining why men have more power, are more socially privileged than women, and arguing that it is natural and inherent. Clarke picks this up and begins talking about the issue of educating women and this idea that women may want to attend college or even progress beyond that into graduate education. And he says, while I'm all for educating women, what we really need to understand is the fact that we cannot treat women like men. We cannot educate women like men, because in his idea, quote, many of the efforts for bettering her education, meaning the generic woman, and widening her sphere seem to ignore any differences of the sexes, seem to treat her as if she were identical with man and to be trained in precisely the same way, as if her organization and consequently her function were masculine and not feminine. So again, this idea that because they have presumably a uterus and other reproductive organs, that women are incapable of doing things that men are, just as men are incapable of tending to children or keeping a home in the way that women are expected to do. And what we see is, as we have more scientists who are focused on this difference and who attempt to use scientific methods to justify these differences, we see social stigmas against women as scientists. Not only are they prevented from enrolling in colleges and especially medical schools, but when those barriers fall, we begin to see legal precedents being set. So for example, when Switzerland allowed women to enroll in medical colleges in the late 1870s, what we see is laws being pushed through in countries surrounding Switzerland and in the UK that say, if you got your medical degree in Switzerland, you cannot practice in your country. So women who had traveled great distances to attend these schools now find themselves back at home and are unable to do anything with the degree for which they had worked so hard. We also see women being legally barred from owning their own businesses and thus unable to open their own practices, even if they have the qualifications to do so. And very often science itself is invoked as a way of justifying these laws, justifying these social barriers against women, because their biology would have you believe that they are only fit to reproduce, that they should stay home, they should take care of the children, they should be having babies, and that to do anything else would be, quote unquote, an offense to nature, which is one of the things that Darwin says. Now, there are plenty of women who push back against this ideology even at the time. One of my favorites is Caroline Kennard, who is a wealthy Boston Brahmin who corresponds with Darwin several times and asks him, indeed, if his opinions of women are as low as they seem to her, especially in his later publications like The Descent of Man. And he writes back and says, it's not that I don't like women, but if women and men attained the same social standing and were doing the same things, that society would entirely collapse. And that we therefore cannot judge women and men in the same category, that we have to understand and respect the differences between them biologically and socially. And Kennard writes back and in part says to Darwin, quote, let the environment of women be similar to that of men and with his opportunities before she be fairly judged intellectually his inferior, please, end quote. And in that letter, what she points out is that women are doing the work of men, it just goes unrecognized. That women indeed manage their budgets at home after the men bring home the paychecks so that they are qualified to do math and accounting, that she follows a line of thinking that a number of women have been posing at this point, that in baking and in cleaning, what you are doing is enacting chemistry, and that this fundamental knowledge is imperative to fulfilling a woman's role, but it goes unvalued and unpaid because it takes place in the home. And the fact that this work goes undervalued is really the problem, not the fact that women themselves are incapable of doing this very important work. And in order to kind of keep my comments to time, we can talk more about filling in the blanks between Caroline Kennard's letters and the impact on women today. But I do want to really emphasize this fact that these trends are ongoing. And we see the problems that manifest in science today, both in research and in practice, as inherently rooted in these ideas of gender difference, of gender essentialism, and the idea that scientists are born. This idea that a certain strata of people attain scientific success in the sciences because of who they are, not because of their education, the opportunities they were given, or indeed their passions that they choose to pursue. Now, while we do see some changes that have occurred over time, especially in the more recent past, these structures are still in place that prevent not only parity in gender and science, but also in deconstructing the ideology that leads to that parity. So, for example, in 2017, women were found to make up about 53% of US medical school admissions, but only 10% of department chairs. And that the rate of attrition from women starting from their bachelor's degree up to the terminal degree in their field and then into success in their field, whether that be tenure, department chair, or in the private sector, tend to decrease precipitously. And a lot of people will attribute this to the fact that women are not structurally able to keep up with the highly competitive nature of a scientific career, that men are more inherently cut out for these things, again, to our previous presentation, that men inherently are risk takers, whereas women inherently tend to shy away from these things without thinking about the social conditioning and the prejudices that go into these assumptions and the way they reinforce themselves. We also see that women physicians on average tend to be paid about $20,000 less a year, even after we think about adjustments. And I think it's important also to recognize that when we think about getting paid less per year, that does add up by the end, and that the accumulation of wealth or that lack of wealth can have really critical implications, not only for the individuals, but for their families and the options that their children have as well. Whoops. There we go. What we also see is positions of leadership in science. And again, my data comes mostly from the United States, tends to reinforce this idea that men are in natural positions of authority in science as a male dominated, but also a male oriented field. And when women attempt to take over leadership, become directors, things like that, what we see more and more is that they are judged more harshly than men, not only on their performance, but on their clothing, their language choices, with this idea that a woman who behaves or performs like a man is doing something unnatural. A callback to Edward Clarke's 1873 text, where he's talking about the fact that we can't treat women and men equally. There we go. In addition, we see still this wage gap, just to kind of drive this home a little bit more. And the fact that over time, while these wage gaps have improved slightly, they are still very much with us. And if we include race into this equation, they become even more self-evident. Finally, the last point that I want to bring up is that there are implications for the general public as well. And one of the maybe the clearest ones for us to talk about is this idea of a Yentl syndrome. So this was a term that was developed by feminist scientists in the 1990s, referencing the movie with Barbara Streisand, Yentl, which is about a woman who wants to attend a rabbinical school but is not allowed even to apply because of her sex. So she dresses as a man, introduces herself as a man to everyone, and is suddenly considered qualified and brilliant and successful in the field. And in coining the Yentl syndrome, what this specifically refers to is the way that heart-related diseases are treated in male and female patients. Now, in the United States specifically, heart disease is the #1 cause of death among women. But despite the fact that we know this, despite the fact that research exists to show us what the symptomology of heart attacks specifically look like in estrogen-dependent female bodies, we still use the male patient as the default. So I did a very quick Google search last night on this, and the images that all popped up when I just type in heart attack symptoms are ones that reinforce this idea that a heart attack manifests as tightness or pain in the chest, that someone is going to grab their heart when they're having a heart attack, and not think about the fact that estrogen-dependent bodies tend to feel pain in their neck and their arm. They tend to talk about symptoms of nausea more often. Whether that is more prevalent or not is a little bit more difficult to tell. And that the ramifications of this become really important. So I also did a Google search to ask about symptoms of heart attack in women, and I come up with a picture of a woman clutching her chest, which is really not how the symptoms of a heart attack manifest in estrogen-dependent bodies. But we see over and over again this reinforcement that heart disease is believed to be a male condition, quote unquote, and that when women present with symptoms that science has shown are normal for their body and their makeup, that they are considered atypical. And indeed, that they're atypical specifically because they are not presenting as men. And very often women are prescribed psychiatric drugs before they are prescribed pain relievers, that their symptoms are thought to be psychosomatic or psychological before they are thought to be physical, again, because women are seen as something different than men and something closer to being childlike than men. Also, as a result, we know that women wait longer in emergency rooms because their symptoms are deemed not critical, and that the survival rate for women with heart attacks tends to be much more dire than men. So, for example, within the first 5 years of a heart attack, about 47% of women who have experienced their first heart attack will die, compared with 36% of men. And not only in that critical moment is this a problem, but what we see is that women are also less likely to receive counseling prior to that first heart attack to help them, whether that is prescribing aspirin or statins, to talk about lifestyle changes, stress reduction, all of the things that male patients are counseled on regularly are obscured for women because of this idea of an inherent, again, not only difference, but a hierarchy of difference that places women in a different category than men, and then uses science to justify that categorization. So I'm happy to talk about this a little more with everyone in the Q&A, but I will leave it there for right now. And thank you again all for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Bridget, for your riveting presentation. I'm sure we will start to get a little bit more fodder for discourse later. In the meantime, Brigitte, if you want to set up your presentation in the meantime, for the audience, Brigitte is a professor of marketing at the International University of Applied Science in Munich and an external lecturer at the University of Vienna. She worked as a postdoc at the Department of Communication at the University of Vienna and the Department of Communication Science and Media Research at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. Her research interests include social media, influencer marketing, science and political communication, and journalism studies. Brigitte is also the co-author of the article Women Scientists on TikTok, New Opportunities to Become Visible and Challenge Gender Stereotypes, published in open access on Cogitatio Press. And I will also link the article in the chat for anyone who's interested in having a read. Brigitte, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you also for the invitation to be part of this fantastic webinar. And yes, as already mentioned, this is the paper I'm going to talk about today, Women Scientists on TikTok, which I wrote together with my co-author, Luis Quesada. So before we talk about social media, let's have a look at what we know about women scientists in traditional media. And research revealed two important things. First, women scientists are underrepresented in media coverage. Studies have shown that only around 20% of scientific experts cited in news stories are female. And the problem is not only that they are not that visible. When they become visible, they often get portrayed in a stereotype way. And here an example. Here you see Professor Sandra Cisek. She's a renowned biologist at a German university and got known by a broader audience when she started to serve as an expert in a podcast on COVID-19 hosted by Public Broadcast in Germany. A magazine interviewed her on this occasion and asked some really inappropriate questions. They asked, for instance, "Are you aware that you are a quota woman?" After the interview, Professor Cisek wrote on Twitter that she was irritated by these questions and that it is quite discouraging for engaging in media contacts. This was in good old Twitter times. So while this example clearly illustrates which problems women are facing when engaging in media contexts, it also shows the potential of social media to speak about stereotypes and to use it as a tool of empowerment and protest. And here you see two prominent hashtags, Women Also Know Stuff and Disgustingly Sexy. The hashtag Women Also Know Stuff was used to promote the work of female scholars and to foster media contact so that they get higher visibility. The hashtag Distractingly Sexy was used by women scientists to protest against sexism in academia. So here you see on the right, remember when women in science were accused of being distractingly sexy, because we are. So what we did in the paper, building on this example and literature, we were interested to see how female scholars use another social media platform, TikTok, that at that time was on the rise for science communication. And according to a recent poll from Pew Research Center, already a third of the US adults use TikTok. And here, our research question, we ask which women scientists are visible, which topics they talk about, and to what extent they also challenge gender stereotypes in their TikTok videos. And to answer these questions, we conducted a quantitative content analysis. We investigated TikTok accounts of female scholars, and we searched by using relevant hashtags such as academic of TikTok, science TikTok, PhD, and so on. And we selected the 50 accounts with the highest numbers of followers. So let's have a look at the results. Results show that 80% of the analyzed accounts were from the natural sciences, and more than 60% of the analyzed account owners were PhD students. However, as you can see, also professors are visible on TikTok. Next, we were interested to see which topics were discussed on TikTok. And the table shows that in 30% of the analyzed videos, female scholars explained concepts or theories. Here you see an example from my field. So a scholar from the field of communication studies discussed theories relevant for explaining relationships. The second most common topic was being a scientist. And here you see a humorous example entitled Tips for Succeeding in Academia. It says, if you work all weekend, then try getting alive. So this was an account that presented several videos in this humorous or ironic style. The third common category in the topics was private life. And here one example was, for example, going skiing, or also, yes, different hobbies and things like that. And finally, let's have a look at the findings for our research question 3. Here our study showed that 11% of the videos challenged gender stereotypes. I will show you now 3 examples what this can look like. The first TikTok video I will show you here was posted by an assistant professor in the field of epidemiology. And the video deals with getting judged by appearances, by clothes. And the video starts by showing that a common insult from trolls is that she's unprofessional for a doctor. So this is what users wrote on under her TikTok videos. And she is then answering like, I work at a university, I'm a PhD, and TikTok is in my office. And then in the rest of the video, she's showing different outfits, different band t-shirts, and she concludes then at the end, watch me dress for success this past week. So this was also a very humorous style of discussing this topic. The second video I would like to show here was posted by a researcher and astronaut candidate. And this video was about the underrepresentation of women in space. And she was talking here to her daughter to discuss this topic. And here you see the dialogue between the two. The girl was saying, Mommy, how many girls have been to space? And she's answering, under 100. And then they continue, and how many girls have been to the moon? And she answers, no. And then the daughter is really worried that it's like, but guys, this is important. So also here you see an innovative way of raising awareness for a problem. And finally, the third video I want to show you was posted by an assistant professor from information science. And it talks about common statements women in tech hear from their male colleagues. And at that time, this was a trend on TikTok, and she jumped on that trend. So the first statement she's showing in the video is, now this is going to get a bit technical. The second one, oh, could you take meeting notes? So a common sentence she heard when being in a meeting with male colleagues. And then finally, I don't know how you balance this job with family. So also a sentence that maybe female scholars in this field will hear a bit more often than their male colleagues. So these videos are nice examples, and I would also like to thank the scientists to have agreed that we show parts of the videos in the talk here. So what of this study? We identified relevant accounts hashtags, and those not using any of these hashtags were not included in the sample. So we also see the role of hashtags on the platform. Then we focused here on empowerment. However, it is also important to investigate hostility and misogyny on social media platforms and also on other platforms. For example, at the moment, we are writing a paper about science communication on Instagram, and we did online group discussions and talked to female and male scholars, and they talked also about hate speech and problems they are facing when doing science communication on social media. And there's also currently a nice project from the Munich Science Lab. They are also doing a campaign to fight hate speech against scientists. Let me conclude with this statement from a YouTube science communicator. If young people do not see women articulating science, the impression will be that women don't do science. So thank you. And if you are interested in findings also from other studies and to connect, then let's meet on Blue Sky or LinkedIn. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brigitte, for your presentation. We'll move on to our last presentation of the day. I will welcome Lena Weber. Lena Weber is, since 2022, has been leading the Center of Excellence Women in Science at GESIS in Cologne. Prior to that, she served as an interim professor for sociology of education at the University of Paderborn between 2020 and 2021. She earned a PhD in sociology from the Department of Arts and Humanities at the University of Paderborn, where she also worked as a research assistant for 10 years. Her research centers on gender-work relations, digital and care work, the gender division of labor, and gender equality policies in academia and research. And we're very glad to have her here to talk to us about the work being developed at the Center of Excellence for Women in Science. Lena, whenever you're ready, we're all ears.
Okay, great. So thank you. Yes, I'm very happy and have the great honor now to present the work of my team, the Center of Excellence Women in Science, short CEWS. And we heard already in the previous lectures a lot about different kind of gender inequalities in academia and research. I like to shed light in my presentation also about what can we do to change and what kind of evidence bases do we have in presenting what kind of work my center is providing. So I firstly will say short something about who we are and what is our aim and scope. Secondly, I move to shed light on the main 3 areas of activities to give some insights for today's celebration on the International Day of Women and Girls in Science. And finally, I would like to give a short statement. So who we are. Now I'm going to give you an overview about our work. CEWS is the German hub for the realization of gender equality in academia and for researching gender inequalities in Germany's academia. It was founded in 2000 and as a project funded by the Germany's Federal Ministry of Education and Research. In 2006, CEWS became part of the Leibniz Institute for Social Sciences, GESIS. We provide different target groups with evidence, data resources, and information on gender inequalities and gender equality measures. For this purpose, we are developing search tools, databases, and publication series. Our main focus is on the situation in Germany. However, we take also part in European projects and also have some European perspectives included. And some of our services are also available in English for those people who are interested in researching the German science system. Now I like to turn to emphasize our three main areas of activities. They are first, gender relations in academia, second, gender monitoring, and third, gender equality policies and measures. And in these areas of activities, we provide with evidence base for people working in politics and policymakers on gender equality and inequalities in academia and higher education. We support social scientists in research about topics on gender equality in academia, and we promote the dialogue between researchers, policymakers, and equality professionals. And in our first area of gender relations in academia, for example, we have one special topic about gender-based violence and sexual harassment. You find information on our website about how to study this field, for example, but also you find there some information and also networks to get connected. Many women are affected by sexism every day, as we already heard today. A buzzword of central protest against these everyday attacks has become the hashtag #MeToo. #MeToo also takes place in academia and science. UNICEF, one project that contributed to a better understanding of gender-based violence and sexual harassment in science. We took also part in this project. Here I'd like to introduce to you my colleague, Anke Lipinski, who was one project lead in the UNICEF project. As part of the project, a survey has been launched in 46 universities and research organizations in 15 European countries. In the study, the prevalence of gender-based violence is defined as a proportion of respondents who have experienced any form of gender-based violence asked since they started at their institution. These different forms of gender-based violence consist of physical violence, psychological violence, economic, sexual violence, sexual harassment, and online violence. It must be remembered that if you look on the prevalence data, it is not easy to say that many reports of violence indicates more violence, as the reporting is also connected to for example, to the awareness of violence. Overall, results show that 62% of the survey respondents have experienced at least one form of gender-based violence since they started working or studying on their institution. Moreover, respondents who identify as LGBTQ+, who reported a disability or chronic illness, and those belonging to an ethnic minority group were more likely to have experienced at least one incident of gender-based violence compared to those who do not identify with these characteristics. Another main field of our work is about gender monitoring. Gender monitoring is an administrative system for permanently observing and controlling how an organization achieves its gender equality goals. Measuring inequality is necessary to make structural discrimination visible and communicable. The underrepresentation of a group can be an indication of structural discrimination, while data collection alone does not reduce discrimination or underrepresentation. It is a tool to support the development, implementation, and review of gender equality measures. One central instrument for monitoring gender equality and to enhance underrepresented groups is a gender equality plan and its monitoring. In all German federal states, universities are obliged to draw up a plan for the advancement of women or gender equality plan. Whether or not there is a reporting obligation, the legal basis for drawing up a gender equality plan results in the need for regular and comprehensive gender equality monitoring at universities. As one service, my colleague Andrea Löther provides the ranking of German higher education institutions by gender equality aspects since 2003 every 2 years. At the moment, we are also part of the European project INSPIRE. In this project, we are investigating how an international monitoring of gender equality plans could be done. For this purpose, we conducted a survey and asked organizations how they developed a gender equality plan and how they monitor it themselves. Further, we gathered also data about gender equality plans via web scraping and analyzed the content of gender equality plans via text analyzers. Our results indicate that overall 41% of the investigated higher education and research organizations have a gender equality plan. And our third area of activities is about gender equality policies and measures. And one example I picked out here is the topic of academic careers and family friendliness in German academia. The ideal academic worker is socially constructed as independent of care duties and lives a flexible, mobile way of life, which is only dedicated to research and scholarship. This understanding of academic work contributed to the exclusion of women in academia for a long time. Due to changes in the engagement for gender equality in the last decades and a slow opening of the academic system in Germany, those normative concepts started to be challenged from different angles. Scholars and researchers of every gender and social background do not want to sacrifice their lives only for academia. Instead, they also want a family life. Against this backdrop, higher education institutions and research organizations are asking how they can improve to be more family-friendly and to become attractive as a study and work organization. To support higher education institutions in this process towards more awareness and help for their staff and members, we provide with an overview of possible tools and resources. Especially, I would like to highlight our database INCA, where you can be inspired by over 90 measures to improve the reconciliation of academic career and family life. But there are a lot of more measures and instruments to explore. And our expert in this area is Nina Steinweg. Finally, instead of a conclusion, I would like to end my presentation by a statement. Recently, the political climate has not become particularly more open to gender equality work and the research of gender inequalities in academia and in broader society. But the work of all those that we heard today and what I showed here in my presentation shows that much has been achieved via this research and that there's still a big need that we need more evidences about gender inequalities. And so it's very worth getting involved, and there's still a lot of work to do. And yeah, I like to end with the statement, let's stand together for this and to create more knowledge and awareness about gender inequalities and in academia and science. Thank you.
So much, Lena, for your presentation and for letting us know the valuable work that's being done in your institute. We will move forward now to our Q&A section. We have plenty of questions to go. I will just leave a note here that I will not address. Some of you have left some comments that are not directly questions to our speakers in the Q&A box. I will not be reading them out, or else we will never end this conversation, but they are there for you to read. And also, if any of the speakers wants to comment on in one of these statements, they are free to do so. I would say, since Lena, you will still have your presentation fresh in our mind, we have a question for you, which is also a way for you to shortly summarize a little bit of your best achievements in CEWS, which is: what are the most effective strategies identified by CEWS for overcoming systemic barriers to gender equality in academia, and how can other institutions apply these insights to create a more inclusive academic environment? So it's a big question, but what would you have to say?
Well, I think it's impossible to say you have to do this one thing and then everything will change. But I think one crucial thing in academic institutions is that you need the leadership. The leadership decides about resources and decides also about the culture inside of an organization. So if you can reach the leadership and if you can do something there, then you have already something, to start the change, to start discussions about awareness, to start about how we need evidences about the gender inequalities, because without evidences you cannot really change anything. So I think it's very important that people understand that this is important also.
Yeah, you were speaking about how to measure, and having those measurements is important to tackle the issue. We just got another question directed to you, which will make me test out a little bit of my German. Let's see. Tatiana asks, do you also have data on the impact of structural conditions such as the Wissenschaftszeitgesetz in academia?
So this is a very specific topic. I don't know if everybody is aware of this, that in Germany we have this legal situation that you cannot be employed at a university longer than for 6 years. So after 6 years, you have to show up a promotion, a PhD, or if you have the PhD, after 6 years, you have to have the habilitation. This is some kind of second qualification process, which is very specific in the German context. And there's much discussion at the moment about this legislation, because they tried to shorten up the periods. So they wanted to improve the situation for the people, they said. So it's a big discussion about how precarious careers are constructed in Germany. And if you want to find out more data on this, then I would like to show you there's a big report every 2 or 4 years, the so-called Bundesbericht über wissenschaftlichen Nachwuchs, and they also have an analysis for the gender relations. So there's always a chapter about this. So I think this is a little bit to wrap the topic for everybody.
Thank you so much also for contextualizing a little bit for everyone to understand. I'll move on to Beatriz now. We have a couple questions for you as well. I'll give you 2 of them, and then you can answer them at your pace. So, hi Beatriz, thank you for your presentation. I believe you mentioned that your data come from the area of political studies. Would you say that this gender gap occurs in all research fields? And are there any comparative studies? The next question also, do you think that there is a tendency of more qualitative/quantitative research methods between men and women? And do you think this is translational in all research fields?
I forgot to turn on the mic. Thank you for the questions, and thank you for all the presentations. It was wonderful to hear everyone speak. The paper that I was talking about in more detail that I co-authored, it is about political science, but in all the presentation, I made sure that I left the papers there for everyone to be able to see. And in all the papers that I cited, only one of them is also about political science. So there's a lot of them that are comparative inside social sciences, but also between social sciences and hard sciences. The most recent one that I will not try and butcher their author's name, but it's the most recent one in 2024. It's a massive study, super comparative, looks at a lot of disciplines, and they all find the same conclusion that there is a gender gap in all disciplines. The second question was about the quality quantity. I'll pick up a little bit of what Bridget said. I'm not trying to be essentialist here. I'm not trying to say that women are designed to make qualitative methodology. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that when you look at data, and there's been studies that have done this that I also made sure that I quoted in the presentation, when you look at data, it is indeed a fact that there's more qualitative papers being authored by women and more quantitative papers being authored by men. I'm not trying to find an explanation for this, certainly not a gender essentialist one, and say that women are more prone to the one or the other. I'm just saying that there is a correlation, and that obviously that correlation has impacts because qualitative takes more time, therefore less research is being made, as in a numerical sort of way, and also because journals, at least in political science, economics, I know that they do tend to prefer quantitative. This also impacts the publishing numbers.
All right, thank you so much. Onwards to Brigitte. There is a question here in our Q&A box that is generating a bit of discussion already. I don't know if you've been putting your eyes on it, but I'll read out the question for everyone and you can give your 2 cents on it. Thank you much for this presentation as well. It was excellent. I also believe that social media could be a great opportunity for women to increase their professional visibility. However, my experience is that the academic community generally laughs at this, both men and women. I ran a science communication blog for 5 years and I received comments like, "Your hair looked nice." But what about the content? Have you ever encountered something like this? Thank you.
Yes, here I can maybe talk a bit about a new study where we did focus groups with scientists communicating on Instagram. And what they taught us is it really depends. For example, one scientist were like, yes, at my university, they really like that I do science communication on Instagram. They think it is important. And they even then when they do the university podcast, then they also contact me because they know that I'm good at explaining and so on. However, then there was also one example where, for example, there was a grant application and then the blogger got the comment like, okay, this guy is spending so much time on the internet, on blogging, everything. So maybe he will not have time to really do the research. So you see, we have really different examples and the spectrum is really very broad and therefore science communication on social media can be seen as a new channel and taken seriously, or some in academia will not like it and will think that it's more one interview just talked about, yes, colleagues told me, okay, will you then become an influencer now? So it's also quite a skeptical reactance. Mm-hmm.
I'll move on now, where there's no questions addressed specifically to Bridget, but I will challenge her, being, to my knowledge, the only person right now that is lecturing in the United States. This is the most voted question that we have here. It's a very topical one. But you are all free to pitch in as well. How might we continue to make progress on reducing the gender gap with the Trump administration attacking DEIA efforts, especially in academia? And if you could explain as well what DEIA means to the rest of the world, we would appreciate it.
Sure. So thank you for the question. And yes, so DEI specifically refers to diversity, equity, and inclusion. and it is an institutional framework that seeks to promote, on paper, fair treatment and full participation for all people, but especially for groups who have been historically underrepresented or marginalized or things like that. And in the past, oh God, it's only been 3 weeks or so, the current administration has attempted to either roll back, cancel, or fire anyone whose job nominally or actively is involved with these practices, with the idea that not only are they putting underqualified or non-qualified people in positions of authority, but also that it is an agenda that is purely for political gain as opposed to something that has a much longer history and is a much more complicated issue. It's going to be very difficult. I think one of the biggest challenges that we face is that essentially power tends to resist cognitive complexity. So it's the idea that the more power you have, the more power you seek, the more you want cognitive ease. So this idea that you shouldn't have your thinking challenged, you shouldn't be unduly exposed to competing ideologies or things like that. And I think that is one of the biggest hurdles against which we are coming right now. I think coming from an American perspective, education is far and away the biggest issue here. And I to be honest, I tell all my students that what I see my role is holding on for them to take over and to model doing things better. So I think investing in education, educating yourself about these things, and doing the work on the smallest scale possible right now is the way to move forward. We are not going to be able to affect large institutional change at the moment, but we can continue to have conversations. We can continue to educate ourselves. And when we are able, that trickle will form a tidal wave.
Yeah. Thank you, Bridget, for this comment. We'll move on to another general question that I will try to aim specifically at one of the speakers again, because I believe it relates a little bit more to what their presentation, but as well, feel free to pitch in as well if you have something to say about this. This one I will aim at Brigitte. Given the current climate for women in academia, which is relevant to all speakers, what is your perspective on how women express femininity in scientific and academic publishing and media coverage, and to what extent does the expression align with or diverge from traditional feminine expression?
This is a very good question. Where to start? I think Bridget told it before that some have the impression that they need to act like men to be taken seriously. So when I think about how women scientists present themselves on social media, one quote from interviews with female scientists on Instagram comes to my mind. It was about from biology, and she's diving in the ocean, and she's aware that if she would choose to present herself in the bikini on the boat, she would get more likes, but she prefers to show the turtles and the sharks and so on. So I think people are really aware of it, and yes, and I'm not sure how much place or space there is for femininity. Yes, it's a good question. Maybe others can jump in.
I mean, I would also jump in and say that no problem is the domain of one group of people. So it also is something about kind of deconstructing what it means to be a masculine person in science as well, and think about deconstructing those ideas as well. So, I mean, I think, you know, a man and a woman diving together or something like that, or recognizing that, as one of my students says, and I roll this one out all the time, but patriarchy was designed to hurt everyone. And I think having those discussions can really help too.
Let's move on then. There are some more things to answer. There's another question for Beatriz, which I believe you have. I paid attention to it, and I think you've kind of answered it in your presentation, but I think you can go through it again. Thanks for your presentation. I believe men submit more because they're organized in networks and automatically co-author more papers. What do you think?
Well, I did quote some papers that did some research on that, and it is shown that men in academia do tend to organize more in networking and in boys' clubs than women do. And obviously this has historical origins. Academia was a male-dominated field for ages, and this is the system trying to perpetuate the status quo and trying to maintain like the way things are done around here at the same level. And obviously this is an informal way of discrimination, but that has real impacts in our labs. Perhaps I could say our labs. But yeah, there's some interesting papers on it that I left the citations on there if this person wants to read them.
And I think I'll move on to our final question. There are some, as I've said, some comments that have been made, some very insightful, also first-hand experiences that were shared in the Q&A box, but they're not questions directly. If you move to the Dismiss tab, you can read a little bit more about them. And also to everyone who has shared these personal perspectives, feel free to then try to further this contact and contacting our speakers if you wish to learn more and to get a more thorough answer for this. But I guess I will end with this statement from Theresa. She speaks, Theresa Schwenke, in the Q&A box. I don't know if you can all see the question. She speaks a lot about her own experience and the experience of some colleagues of hers juggling their personal lives and their academic work. She says, we all got severe pressure by the directorate to finish without even looking to the individual situations. Some supervisors say something against, some transport the pressure directly to the PhD candidate. Our woman representative does not know about all these cases. To me, she said, finish your PhD and you will have no tensions with the directorate or your supervisor. What should I do to raise awareness and understanding? Not talking about eye level or appreciation. And I believe all of you can chime in with something.
Just wanted to say, because it's a very special situation in Germany, to look for advice from a lawyer or from Gewerkschaften. We have also people in the Gewerkschaft of Education that can help on this issue, because it's about the interpretation of the period. And if you have kids and if you have special conditions, like your partner has a very disease, very a strong disease, then I think there are possibilities to make the qualification period longer and to give them more security. However, I know this is really the case for the German science system, that we have this precarity, and yeah, this makes me also very sad to see.
Thank you, Luna, for your intervention and try to help this specific case with your knowledge of how the inner workings of these environments work. I will allow this last question that we got before we end. This is really the last one. How might emerging technologies For example, AI in biotechnology impact gender equity, women's autonomy, and play in advancing public policies aimed at gender equality. I don't know if anyone wants to take this one to wrap it up.
I mean, I will jump in with I have my cynical shoes on today, but right now, I am not very hopeful. I think, as we have seen in a number of studies have shown, the data as history that a lot of these algorithms are fed are biased. So therefore, their output tends to be biased. I think there is a very long narrative in especially Western societies that technology can somehow protect us from our vulnerabilities, can answer the questions that we don't know that we have yet, can overcome human biases and things like that. And we continue to rely on those devices rather than working on the roots of these bias, and especially taking time to work on them too. And I think this sense of urgency really is incredibly harmful as well. That doesn't mean there's not a future where it can be useful. But right now, not only are there, for me, there are too much data pointing to the recurrence of bias for gender, for race, for ability, and all these things in AI technologies for it to feel like it is going to be able to promote something different. But also, we remain too uneducated about what the algorithm is actually doing, how it actually functions, for us to be able to overcome its deficiencies as well. So those are some of the things that I think about a lot with this.
Can I just jump in to agree with what Bridget was saying, José? I think there's a common point that ties these two last questions together, the one about the number of years doing the PhD and the one about AI, which is that we're always trying to aim at being neutral, or trying to run machines that make us neutral, or have neutral laws about how to conduct a PhD, or have this idea that if you do a PhD in 4 years, it's the norm. But all these norms and all these tentatives, like not tentatives, that's a Portuguese word, all these ways that we're trying to be neutral are just reinforcing the male bias. Because what actually happens when you try to be neutral or gender neutral is that you reproduce the way men have been doing things, because you look at history and you look at, okay, how have things been going on when we didn't look at gender? Okay, then that means that's neutral, but that's actually the male way of doing things. So that's my concern about AI and about like these norms that make us think that we have to complete PhDs in certain number of years, or not look at specific cases of people and not treat people as people, which is the same thing AI does, which is just treat us as data and numbers. So just some thoughts.
Thank you so much, Beatriz. Thank you, Bridget, as well. I will call it a day here with our questions. This was truly a very, very, very insightful session that we had. I want to thank all of the people who attended and who shared their personal stories, who asked questions, who asked for the work that some of you have presented here in this webinar. Again, thank you all, Bridget, Brigitte, Beatriz and Lena. It was a real pleasure to work with you and to listen to your presentations today. And yeah, this webinar, as I've said, is going to be up on YouTube, on the Cogitatio Press YouTube page very soon. All the presentations, if our speakers consent to it, will be shared with our attendees soon after this presentation, because we also got a lot of questions asking to see the presentations afterwards. And if you want to stay up to date with our publications as well, you can follow Cogitatio Press on YouTube and on LinkedIn. We also have 5 journals, and we are present on social media with each of our 5 journals as well. And I hope to see you all in one of our next events. Thank you so much for coming as well, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you for organizing.
Thank
Truly.
you, José. Bye.
It was a pleasure. Bye.
to have some positive feeling in the end.